Hey guys, my name is James Johnson, and I am the Chief Officer of Spiritual Development here at Honey Lake Clinic, which is just a fancy way of saying that I'm in charge of all the spiritual care and programming that we do here. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend your time with me today as we discuss the idea of moral injury and how we can view it from a spiritual perspective, from a spiritual lens. And I'm going to put my share my screen to put the presentation up, but I wanted you to have a face to go with the name and to personally let me say thank you for your time, because in the clinical world and the therapy world, we don't often incorporate spirituality and spiritual care, and because some people are afraid of it. Some people believe that only the patient should bring it in. But by understanding who we are on the inside from a spiritual perspective, we can really help our clients, help our patients to develop a much more whole and healthy lifestyle, and by taking care of their spiritual life and addressing certain areas of our life that can only be made well if we look at it from a spiritual perspective. So let me try to share my screen with you, and we will get this going. All right. Well, like I just said, we're going to talk about viewing moral injury through a spiritual lens. That's my name, that's my title, and that's Honey Lake Clinic, where I get the pleasure of working. If you are a note taker and you would like a copy of this presentation, it should be included with the webinar. But if you would like an individual copy of this for you to use for your own personal use and teaching, please feel free to email me, and I'd love to send this presentation to you, because there are a lot of things that are in here that I might not have time today to unpack, and I want to make sure that we cover it well. So as we go through the process, this is something that you're welcome to have. jjohnson@honeylakeclinic.com. So as we start our discussion time together, I'd always love to kind of give a starter question. And the idea that I'd want to chat about briefly is something that you lost or gave away that you wish you could have back. Usually when I bring this question up, I think back to an old Honda hatchback that I used to have when my wife and I first got married. And I got a great deal on it from this sweet old lady who only used it to go to the grocery store and back. And it was just such an amazing deal. And as I had it for a while, I had to learn how to drive stick shift. And it was just a fun car to have. And I'm Army chaplain. And while I was away for a long time with the Army, my wife was pregnant and she got too round, so to speak, to fit behind the wheel. And so while I was gone and could not communicate with her, she sold it and got a different vehicle. And I missed that car. I wish I could have it back. And for many of us, we have things in our lives that we've lost. Sometimes they're, physical things like a car, or maybe a jacket, or sometimes people, when I ask this question, talk about a piece of jewelry or a guitar or motorcycle, something like that that they used to have that they no longer have anymore, and they wish they had it back. But sometimes they talk about things that are part of their life, part of their identity, part of who they are, that they no longer have, and they wish they could have it back. And whether it's something personal or something physical, we recognize that each of these things only has value because they mean something to us as a person. Meaning that that car that I miss, it wasn't a super expensive car. It wouldn't sell for thousands of dollars, but I miss it. And we think about the things in life that really are valuable to us are often not things that have physical value or monetary value. They are things that have sentimental value. That part of our life shows us the power that the spiritual component of who we are is in our lives. So this is just an example of my more pictures of me and some of my military travels, deployments I've come back from, and of course pictures of my beautiful family. My girls, our youngest, the blonde, is Aria, and she is now 12. The one with the taller one, the older, is Aiden, and she is turning 14 next month. And of course, my wife, Heather, who has been taking care of me and supporting me in all of these military adventures and life adventures. We will be married next week. We'll have been married 19 years. So she's been my battle buddy through all of this. And as I've gone and done some amazing things, I've missed out on a lot. I've missed out on birthdays. I've missed out on anniversaries. We were remarking how next week, when we celebrate our 19th anniversary, it will be the first anniversary I've been home for in the last like 8 years. Every other time I've been gone with the military doing something somewhere. And it takes things that we can't get back. We can try to make it up, but we can't go back in time and replace those events, those birthdays, those dance recitals, those important life events. One I was lamenting just the other day was when I wasn't there when my daughters learned how to ride bicycles. I wasn't the one that you kind of get this movie picture holding the seat and pushing it down the road. My father did that. Their grandfather taught them how to do that. I wasn't there for that. Things in our life get taken from us. And a lot of times in life, it's a trade-off, but man, we can't get them back. And these things that mean so much to us are connected to our spiritual life, who we are. This is why spirituality is such an important ingredient to incorporate into your scope of care when treating and caring for people. Because spirituality is that indefinable need we all have inside of ourselves, that yearning to connect with something greater, something bigger than ourselves. And religion is a vehicle for that. I'm a Christian, I'm a Christ follower, and I'm very devoted to my faith. I believe wholeheartedly in it. But my spirituality is bigger than that. It's greater than that. It's just not just how I connect to God and my Christian faith and beliefs. It's how I connect to others. What gives my life ultimate meaning and purpose? Religion is a component, it's a vehicle, but spirituality is greater than that. And if you work with clients who are not Christian, you can still work to improve their spiritual life. It's just you have to take a little bit of a different route that we'll talk more about as we go through. Why is spirituality important? Well, tons of studies show that a person that has a strong spiritual religious foundation is much more capable of dealing with traumatic experiences, stress, and they can go through these things and actually come out stronger than they did before. They can experience post-traumatic growth, and we'll go much deeper into post-traumatic growth in just a little bit. But think of it like a broken bone. Nobody wants to have a broken bone. It's painful. It requires adjustments. When you go to the doctor, having a broken bone set is painful. Sometimes surgery is involved to set that bone and put a cast on it. But when you look at x-rays later, you can always see where a bone was broken. There's a line on the x-ray that shows you where that fracture, where that broke bone happened, that break occurred. And the reason why you can see that line is the bone heals back stronger than it did before it was broken. And so this is important because we need that strength. It's stronger. If a person has a weaker spiritual religious foundation, then that makes them more susceptible to experience moral injury, problems with forgiveness, desires to isolate, and it can stunt their emotional, mental, and spiritual development. Spirituality is important. It's not just something for church and for holy books and prayers and Bible studies. It's important for every single person. So when we talk about moral injury and we talk about spiritual struggles, we have to recognize that there's a way that we build our identity. There's a way that we establish who we are as people and individuals. And I call this the pyramid of identity. The bottom of the pyramid, the foundation, is our worldview. And our worldview is exactly that. It's the way we view the world. It's our beliefs about the way the world is supposed to work and operate, how life should be experienced. Out of our worldview, we develop and define our values. These are the things that matter the most to us in our life. These are the things that we refuse to compromise on. And there are different types of values that I'm sure we could spend time going into, but the recognition is that there are some things in our life that are more meaningful to us than others, and there are some areas we will easily compromise on. Those help us figure out what are the things that we value the most. And then the top level, is our ethics. This is our actual behavior. And each one dominoes into the next. Your worldview helps you define your values. Your values help you determine your ethics, how you behave. So, for example, we would say, all right, in my worldview, as a follower of Jesus, as a Christian, one of my beliefs is that the Bible is God's word and it should be followed. And it should be, read appropriately in context, but I should follow its dictates and commands. One of the things that the Bible teaches is that I shouldn't lie and that lying is wrong. So when I determine my values and I look at all of this, I say, wow, this is the way I actually think my life should be lived. And so one of my values is honesty. I believe that a person needs to be honest and tell the truth. And so my ethics will be to be honest and not lie. But we have to recognize that the further we get from the foundation, the less rigid it is. A worldview is incredibly strong and rigid, uncompromising. Your values will be a little bit more flexible, and your ethics will be much more than that. I usually you share a joke at this point and talk about how in a worldview, we may say in the Christian worldview, the Bible teaches that we should respect governing authorities and we should obey the laws of the land so long as they are not unethical or immoral. And so in my value would be to have obedience to and respect for the government. But my ethic is my actual behavior. And so at this point, I'll ask people in the room, how many of us are speeders? How many of us break the speed limit? And most hands in the room will go up. And I'll say, but hold on, you valued that integrity and that obedience to the government from your worldview of the Bible. So you are a lawbreaker. You are compromising your values and your worldview in your ethics. And of course, then they give me all kinds of reasons. And we talk about how do we determine how fast we're going to go over the speed limit? Is it 5 miles an hour, 10, 15? One person, last time I asked this question, said they go 18 miles over the speed limit because if they go 20 or more, they're going to end up going to jail. And so those kinds of things. But in a more serious example, go back to that idea of honesty. The Bible says not to lie. That's my worldview. Honesty becomes my value, and telling the truth becomes my ethic, my behavior. But what if I'm in Nazi Germany and I'm a Christian living in Nazi Germany during World War II, and a group of Jews, a Jewish family, knocks on our door in the middle of the night and asks if they can stay in my family's basement as they try to escape Berlin to get out of the nation of Germany, where they're safe. And I say, sure, we'll hide you because you're a human being. We're Christians. We believe you're valuable. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a knock on the door, and it's a German SS officer asking me if I have any Jews in my house. Do I keep my value of telling the truth and not my ethic of that? Is honesty still the best policy? Well, no, I lie, because I want to protect and preserve their lives. You see, the further we get away from the bottom of the pyramid, the foundation, the more willing we are to negotiate those things. And this is important to recognize so that we know who we are, what we value, and what we believe about the world. That's why developing a worldview is such an important thing. When we develop a worldview, it develops how we experience the world and how we believe life is supposed to operate. How are things supposed to go? And when we encounter something that makes us recognize that that's the way we view the world doesn't match up with reality, we experience a crisis of faith or an identity crisis, however you want to phrase it. That, for example, when I was young, I grew up believing and being taught that if you do good things, you will receive good things. If you do bad things, you'll receive bad things. And so if I tell the truth and I'm a good citizen, then I will, receive good jobs and have a good life. If I do bad things, I will end up getting arrested and go to jail and be punished. But then as I got older and started looking around, I began to see honest people who lived good lives receive bad things in life. They wrestled with their finances. They struggled to climb the ladder. They had trouble, with their relationships. But then I saw people who did bad things, that they stole and they lied and they cheated and they broke the law, become wealthy and even respected. So my worldview no longer matched up with reality, and I had to shift and adjust my worldview. So, how do we build a worldview? How do we determine what we believe about how the world is supposed to work? And we do that by answering these four questions. We call these the ontological questions. Ontology is the study of meaning. What gives life purpose or something, a reason for existence? And the four questions deal with origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Origin asks the question, where did everything come from? And the cheesy response is Amazon, right? Because it feels like that's where everything comes from. But when we talk about everything, we're not talking about our shopping choices. We're talking about the world, the universe, life. Where did everything come from that we see here on this planet and in space? And the things we can't see on the microscopic level, where did everything come from? Meaning asks the question, what is the purpose of my life? Morality asks the question, who determines what is right and what is wrong? And destiny asks the question, what happens to me when I die? The way we answer these four questions, and one dominoes into the other, origin dominoes into meaning, meaning dominoes into morality, and so on. The way we answer these questions determines our worldview, how we view the world. So if you believe, or what I was taught in public school, and a lot of people do, we begin to say, all right, where did everything come from? Well, in my biology class, I was taught that in the beginning, nothing existed and the Big Bang happened. And all of a sudden, out of nothing, everything exploded into being. And time plus matter plus chance over billions and billions of years created the planet, created the primordial ooze we all came out of, single-celled organisms that evolved over billions and billions of years into humans. And so if that is the truth, what I learned in public school, if that is true, then what's the purpose of my life? Well, if the answer to origin is true, then I have no purpose in my life. I'm an accident of time. I'm a product of time plus matter plus chance. And that dominoes into morality. Who determines what is right and what is wrong? Well, we do as a culture. We do as whoever has it's all up to us. The second or version of the golden rule, like Jesus's golden rule, was treat others the way you want to be treated, right? If you were a Sunday school kid like me, you learned that. But the world, our secular culture will say that the golden rule is the person with the most gold makes the rules. The person with the most money, the most power, the most opportunity, the most ability and influence. That determines right and wrong. It's all subjective to culture and personal opinions. And then destiny, well, if I'm here by accident, purely by chance, then when I die, I just die. And what happens with this when we walk down this road, we recognize that this opens the door for some pretty scary situations. You see, when we believe this, if we believe what I learned in public school, that Darwinian evolution, or as my college professor called it, the goo to you via the zoo, it creates problems with our morality and our spiritual life in our postmodern world. Morality became really up for grabs in the 1980s as the period of modernity came to an end and the postmodern world came into being. If you were to look at the studies of the three most recent generations, they believe that truth is relative, that morality, right and wrong, is subjective, and that we all have to determine our own truth and our own goals and purpose in life, and it's up to us to do it. There is no overarching grand design and purpose for us. We all have to figure it out on our own and live the way we best see fit based off of our feelings. The problem with this is it's the echoes of what we experienced in the 1900s. Going back to these four questions, one of the things that Adolf Hitler famously said is that he wanted to raise up a generation devoid of a conscience. When Hitler and the Nazi Party took power in Germany, one of the first things they did was get rid of religion, and especially Christianity. They did not want any moral compass to be influential in, to conflict with their rule and their decisions and their implementation of their laws. And so as a result, by telling people, hey, where did everything come from? Well, man, we are here by accident. And the purpose of my life is to live the best I can. And so what we have to recognize is that some people are better than others, because that's what evolution teaches us, that we have to evolve, right? Survival of the fittest is what I learned in school. And so if we recognize that there are some that are more fit than others, some people that are better than others, we need to get rid of those that are not as fit, that are not as good. And Hitler and his leadership began to single out different people. We remember mostly the Jews, but there were tons of other groups as well that were sent to their deaths in concentration camps and gas chambers. Because who determines what's right and what's wrong? If morality is subjective, I have to listen to others and what feels right. What do I believe inside me based off my feelings? You see, we have this idea of a moral compass. But the problem is, because of a series of events we'll look at in just a second, we have to recognize that for most people, the letters on their compass have been rubbed off. They have a needle, they have a feeling for what is going on, but they have no clue if that's the right direction. They don't know which way is true north because they have rubbed the letters off of their compass. What are some of the things that contributed to that? Well, there were many things, but here are some of the highlights. When we look at U.S. history, what created the moral problems that we are experiencing now? Well, in the 1890s brought about the death of God movement that started in Europe with guys like Friedrich Nietzsche, and it came over in the early 1900s into the U.S. culture. We actually began to believe that science and technology needed to replace God, that religion was the placeholder because we didn't have the answers to the way the world really worked. So we believed in religion to support that. Well, what ended up happening is that as science and technology began to take over and we got rid of God, and then we believed that, oh, God is dead. Let's replace him with science. We don't need God anymore. We'll become God, basically. And so what happened? We said, oh, since God is no longer real, and we know that it's just something that history showed us as a way to answer the unanswerable questions, we don't need that anymore. It became illegal to teach about God and creation in public schools after the Scopes trials and many other government policies that were implemented. Right after that, the Great Depression happened, World War I, World War II, and as we go through time, we see a parallel between the evil experiences that people went through in the world with the removing of God from our culture. After World War I and World War II, and the Depression happened, man, life just became incredibly terrible, and war broke out, and people began to see the horrors of reality, and it made us want to really just doubt what life was all about. The 40s and 50s took God out of the government. We made legislation and legal processes that said we can't speak about God in our government proceedings anymore. They took separation of church and state to an extreme. The reality was separation of church and state. The Establishment Clause was to protect the church from the government, not to keep the government from having any church in it, right? From having any God in it. And so as a result, the domino effect of the 60s and 70s, we had the free love generation and the revolution that got God out of our homes. And as the people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, they said, God's not important. Spirituality may be important, but not God. And in the 80s, the modern period ended, and we became disillusioned. We stopped believing that science and technology would provide all the answers. But we'd also gotten rid of the God who gave us those answers as well. And so now in postmodernism, we have a compass with no letters on it. Why does this matter? Because when we experience some of these traumatic life events, the unspeakable things like this case study, we have to figure out, what do we do with it? So here's a case study from the Vietnam War in the village of My Lai. During the Vietnam War, March 16th, 1968, 500 unarmed villagers were killed by U.S. soldiers. The soldiers did this due to the Viet Cong, the military we were fighting in Vietnam, using guerrilla tactics. This means they would hide in the woods and they would try to come out and fight the U.S. military. And when we would start overrunning them, they would retreat and hide in local villages. And because they did not wear military uniforms, they just blended in with the rest of the village and we would lose them. And after this happened over and over and over again, one of the army commanders gave the order to kill the whole village. We know that the Viet Cong bad guys are in the village, so we just kill everybody. And the soldiers then had to choose between obeying direct orders from a military, officer, and if they disobeyed them, they could be put on trial in a court martial. They could be, convicted of treason and lose their lives, or they could kill innocent people. And those soldiers chose to take the lives of 500 unarmed human beings that day. What effect does that have on people when they're sitting in a situation where they have a worldview that doesn't line up with reality and their experiences? When they go through these situations, we have to figure out, how do we settle this? How do we make sense of life? Karl Marlantes, in his book, What It's Like to Go to War, says that a worldview that does not match up with reality is a waste. And he's absolutely right. And as we look at this, we encounter the theodicy, we encounter evil. And we have to look at this from one of two perspectives. From the Christian perspective, we ask the question, if God is all good and all powerful, why is there evil in the world? If you don't include God in the equation, we have to ask, why is there evil in the world? Well, who defines evil? Who says something is right or wrong? And that just shakes the snow globe up even more, because we know in our hearts that what the Nazis did to the Jews and many other people in the Holocaust during World War II, where 25 million people were killed, 6 million of them plus being Jewish people, we can say that was wrong, but we have no way to justify it. In the Christian perspective, we have to deal with this problem. If God is there and he has all the power and he's all good, all loving, why is there evil in the world? Why doesn't he stop it? Well, the theological answer is that we have free will. And our free will brought sin into the world, which also brought evil and death. That people are evil because we want to do our own thing. We're selfish. And we have the free will to do that. Here's the problem I run into when I work with people and I give them this answer. It's frustrating because it makes sense. It's what the Bible teaches, but it doesn't make us feel better. And so both the Christian and the person looking from a secular viewpoint, we recognize there's a conflict here. There's an issue that we have to answer. And the reason is because trauma is real. Evil is real. Trauma is that emotional response to a terrible event, such as an accident, rape, or a natural disaster. And we recognize, and this is something I'm sure you know already, is that while trauma may be different for every person, it's still trauma. It's still a traumatic experience. And trauma is not rare. We may go through life thinking that we are unique and that nobody has been through struggles like we've been through struggles. And in a sense, that's true because every person is unique. But we're not unique in that we are the only ones who have gone through traumatic experiences. 6 in every 10 men and about 5 out of 10 women experience at least one trauma in their lives. Trauma affects us both physically, mentally, and spiritually. So what do we do with this? Well, it depends on what kind of trauma we experience. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip that case study. And if you want to look at it later, we might have time to come back, or you can email me for the presentation. In many cases, if a trauma cannot be resolved with a coping mechanism or skill to process through it and move forward in life, it can develop into PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This happens as a result of a person experiencing or witnessing a life-threatening event. It's estimated that 8% of civilians and 20% of military veterans have some level of PTSD. You're looking at one, right? That I have, been diagnosed with PTSD from the, experiences I have had in the military. And so when we look at PTSD, it's what happens when we go through a traumatic experience and our brain just cannot process it. It does not make sense with the way the world is supposed to work. And so our brain just leaves it there. It creates a roadblock for our neural pathways and our neural processes, and it results in things like brain fog and memory problems. And PTSD is a very, very big struggle for a lot of people. But what we're focusing on today is moral injury, and that's a little different. Moral injury, I'm going to skip that case study too. I apologize for the sake of time. It says that The psychological, social, and spiritual impacts of involving betrayal or transgression of one's own deeply held moral beliefs and values that occurs in a high stakes situation. That was the original definition of moral injury that Dr. Jonathan Shea created in the early 90s and continued to work on into the early 2000s. It's this idea of a betrayal is the core aspect of what creates moral injury. We feel betrayed in what we've experienced. For those gentlemen that in the military that killed those 500 villagers, men, women, and children, the enemy army and the innocent civilians, that was a betrayal. They had been told by their government, basically, their military leaders who were supposed to guide them in right behavior, to do the wrong thing. And they had to choose which evil they were going to do. And it created a betrayal, and it made them transgress their moral beliefs of the sanctity of life and humanity and the way war is supposed to be conducted. Until Vietnam, war had been conducted largely on an equal scale, following certain rules. But in Vietnam, guerrilla warfare showed us that we had a lot of things that both the enemy, the Viet Cong, and we did as a military through things like Agent Orange and napalm. And so what we've recognized is that moral injury does not just apply to military experiences. It can happen to anyone. It can happen to anyone when a person experiences a traumatic or unusually stressful circumstance where they perpetrate, fail to prevent, or witness events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. This focuses less on the betrayal aspect and more on the contradiction of your deeply held moral beliefs and the expectations of the way the world is supposed to work. And so as we look at each of these, we can recognize that a person can experience PTSD without moral injury, and a person can experience moral injury without PTSD. However, 70% of the time, they occur together. And this is important because many times PTSD is labeled as the problem and moral injury is left off. PTSD can be medically diagnosed, clinically treated, but moral injury is not something that can be medically diagnosed. And so how can a person prepare for or prevent a moral injury? Well, when we look at this, we have to recognize that when people experience a morally injurious event, this is an event that creates the possibility of a moral injury. So one of the things that I have observed in life is that not everyone responds to trauma the same way based off their age, their maturity, their experiences. All of those things can and the way they view the world, their religious beliefs, all of these things determine if they can make sense of what happened. So, for example, as a hospital chaplain, one time there was a young boy, a 6-year-old boy who had leukemia, and he died. And while his parents grieved, their spirituality, their Christian faith, allowed them to recognize that this young boy and their beliefs was going to spend eternity in heaven, and that one day they would be reunited with him again. And so they grieved that loss, but they had hope and could go through this process, and they did not experience a moral injury, even though they experienced a traumatic event. On the other hand, I've seen people go through similar experiences who did not have that strong faith and that spiritually charged worldview, and it caused them to recognize in their belief set, they believed they would never see their loved one again and that it was all over. And they did not agree with the way the world is supposed to work, because in our American Western culture with our advanced medical practices, we believe in our culture that children should outlive their parents. Parents should never have to bury their children. That creates a morally injurious event. It creates a possibility for a moral injury. And so as a quick sum up, we recognize that morally injurious events happen in one of three situations: either the perpetration, meaning that I did the action; omission, I failed to stop the action or event; or observation, I simply saw it happen. And all of these can become morally injurious events. Now, the result of this is that it creates within us a soul wound. A soul wounding is when we experience something inside of ourselves that we can't reconcile. We can't find a place for it in our mind and in our hearts to say, how do I make peace with this? How do I put this in the right place? And so when we look at all of this, we have to say, okay, how do I make peace with it? How do I balance all of these things? I'm shaken up like a snow globe and everything's spinning around me. How do I let everything settle again? We have to go back to that worldview and say, how do I make a worldview that makes sense of the world? So we've talked about some of these examples: betrayal, church hurt. In the spiritual Christian world, when people expect God to give them a miracle or have a healing, and it doesn't happen. And the person that we prayed for either dies or suffers because God did not heal them. These can create soul wounds that can lead to moral injury. But here's the goal. The goal is to utilize proper tools to treat moral injury to facilitate post-traumatic growth. When a person goes through the symptoms of loss and grief, struggling to make sense of the world, they need treatment for that to reconcile reality with their beliefs. And what can happen is a person can actually utilize these events, these morally injurious events, to become better, like a bone that heals back stronger so they can enjoy life again. So when a person experiences these events and they have a moral injury that needs to be reconciled, well, this is where spiritual care comes into place. Moral injury is a form of spiritual religious struggle. It impacts our connection to meaning and purpose and to the things that are greater than ourselves. We, as a spiritual care team, or by integrating spiritual care into your practice, you can help your patients and your people that you work with, your clients, to develop a strong spiritual religious foundation that makes sense of life, like we've talked about before, to become spiritually resilient. We also talked about this, but just as a quick reminder, that PTSD and moral injury have similar symptoms. They present the same, but they are not the same. They often, 70% of the time, they do occur together, but PTSD comes from being in mortal danger, fear of losing your life. Moral injury is caused by a moral danger, something that does not line up with reality and the way the world is supposed to work. So how do we treat this? Well, moral injury is a soul wounding experience that requires a three-part process to reconcile it. We have to identify the problem, address the problem, and process the problem so that we can foster growth. We have to create a treatment plan that addresses all three of these areas, and it really helps to have a team approach if possible. If your client or your patient is working with a treatment team with a medical provider, a behavioral health provider, and a spiritual care provider, and they work as a team together, they can truly help in a very powerful way. But even if you don't have that, you can incorporate this process into your life to begin to see the bigger picture. Like we said before, there are processes we need to go through. The first step is to identify the incident, such as the young boy with leukemia dying in the hospital. That family, the parents, would need to understand, how did it impact their lives? They need to recognize that this loss needs to be grieved. It doesn't make sense with the way the world is supposed to work and their beliefs. And then, after they understand why they feel the moral injury, they have to understand how they address it. How are they going to work through that? Are they going to take a faith approach? Are they going to try to, reconcile this by looking at how this event can make them stronger and how going through loss can actually help us to understand what really matters in life? Well, the goal is to find a way to help them reconcile these events in a way that gives them acceptance, understanding, and hope. And at the risk of being maybe too simple or too blunt, I personally believe that the only way to truly resolve moral injury is through the Christian perspective. As a guy that spent a lifetime studying faith and religion and spiritual beliefs, the teachings of Jesus and the way of Christianity is the only one that matches up in alignment with the human experience, but it's not always that easy. People can get hurt by their belief in God and have struggles reconnecting with the God that they worship when they go through these things. This is why we have a three-part process of accepting what happened, admitting that it happened, and letting it be real, integrating it into their life story, and then being able to transform into a stronger and more resilient person. The problem is there's barriers. And we talked about some of these already, but these are the big barriers that studies show keep people from being able to resolve this, even if they have a strong spiritual foundation. The first is the fear of confronting or reliving the issue. To bring it back up, to admit that it's real, means that we have to confront it, and it often means at some level experiencing it again. It's like ripping the Band-Aid off of a wound. You know, it may have healed and created a scab, but when you pull that bandage off, it starts to bleed all over again. But that's what's needed in order to make sure the wound heals cleanly and gets treated properly. Well, if we do that for physical wounds, we definitely should do it for spiritual wounds, where we have to get into the issue and address it and overcome that fear. Another barrier to treating moral injury is culture. Many people come from cultures that deal with the honor-shame mentality instead of the guilt-innocence mentality we tend to have in the United States. We are built on this idea of proof, right? Evidence. If I can submit enough evidence to prove I'm innocent in a court of law, then I'll be vindicated. But I can also use that to overcome my feelings of guilt, to say, see, I feel guilty for this happening, but looking at the reality of the evidence helps me shed that and say, wow, I don't need to put that guilt and blame on myself when it really wasn't my fault. This is very different from the honor-shame mentality. A lot of Eastern cultures come from this idea that it is, if you act with honor, you improve your character, and you bring, you know, these congratulations and these honorable things onto your family and your culture and your group, whatever that group is. And if you do something that shames it, you not only dishonor yourself, you also dishonor your family. A really great example of this is in the Disney movie Mulan. We see how Mulan wants to bring honor to her family, and her mistakes actually bring dishonor to them. And so she seeks to bring honor back through her actions, because she no longer wants to have that shame and that representation within her family and her community. Now, in the ages before, in previous generations, we could separate these two things out. But now the world is becoming more connected, and it's very difficult to determine what type of culture a person comes from, and we need to dig into this. We also need to wrestle with the conflict that happens between our beliefs and reality. A person may have a false belief, a struggle that makes them think that they have been taught something that they believe is true, but you and I know does not align with reality. This happens a lot in religious extremism, cult groups that have beliefs that don't really align with reality, and it can be difficult to help people process. Anger towards God, feelings of self-betrayal. They believe that they deserve what they're going through because of their actions, or a lack of honesty. They haven't been really true and honest and upfront about the issue. This happens a lot in the military. They do not want to tell the whole story because they do not want to be condemned or rejected by fellow soldiers or by the military as an institution. Behavioral health in the military has a big stigma. If people go for mental health treatment, they will be seen as unfit for duty and either not be able to serve as a soldier. They may not even be able to serve in the military period. So as we overcome these barriers, we need to recognize the three-part process for solving and addressing spiritual conflict. The first thing we have to do is admit what happened. We've got to quit hiding it. We've got to quit covering it up. A lot of times we treat these situations like a child cleaning their room. I don't know if your children did this or if you did this when you were a child, but my girls do this, or did this when a lot more when they were younger. They would shove everything in all the mess into their closet and shut the door, and it looked like their room was clean. But they say, "Oh, Daddy, don't open the closet." And why? Because that's where the mess was. But that's not how we clean a room. We open the door, we get all the things out, and we put them in their right place. But we can only do that when we admit and accept that there is a mess to start with. And then the integration process happens. We put the things in the right place. This trauma, this traumatic event, this moral injury happened, and I have to integrate it into my life story, who I am as a person, and learn how to put it in its right place. It happened. and I've got to accept it as part of who I am now. And now I have a new identity. I've been transformed into a new person because of this experience. It changes my worldview, it changes my values, and it changes my ethics because it changes my identity. And that's transformation. If we do this well, we can help people actually become stronger and better. So here's the method that we use at Honey Lake Clinic in our spiritual care department. We use the pastoral narrative disclosure model, and it follows an 8-step process where we begin to meet the patient or the client where they are. We build rapport and we have them share what's going on. We review these ideas, and then we help them to reconstruct their life story in a way that truly aligns with reality. This allows them to be much more objective than they would otherwise. It allows them to separate themselves from the feelings, those strong feelings of guilt and shame and remorse. And then they can see the story for what it really is. The next step is to help them experience restoration. How do I, after I see the story for what it really is, how do I get back to a life that I can live and enjoy? And that's where restoration comes in. And that's where we not just identify the problem and address it, we also help them make sense of it and say, how do you want to move forward? Part of this is through some sort of ritual where we help them create a therapeutic ritual to renew and remind them they're moving into a new chapter. Maybe it's something like baptism. Maybe it is the writing of the letter to their past self or the person that betrayed them, where they let it go and they burn that letter, or they shred it up into pieces and throw it away, whatever helps them to let that go, to set it down and experience a renewal of who they are. And the last step, if we try to help them reconnect with the things in life that give them meaning and purpose that they have been separated from because of their trauma. And that's a brief overview. If you want more information on pastoral narrative disclosure, I'd be glad to chat with you later. So as we wrap up this time, if you have questions, please email me. Please send them in. I'd love to help you with that. Once again, my name is James Johnson. I hope this helps for you to recognize where a moral injury comes from, how it occurs, and how we can treat it by working to integrate spiritual care processes into our practice. So this is my name. This is my contact information. I really hope that this was helpful. I hope that we can use this in your life to make you better at providing care to your patients. And most of all, I hope that this blesses you. And if you need anything that I can help with, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for attending.